with me. So, with that, let's proceed to the latest update on the situation in Ukraine. And I think before we do that, I think there's a point I do want to clarify about the Russian announcements about troop deployments, which took place on Tuesday, that famous meeting between Putin and Defense Minister Shoigu, which I think has been widely misreported, especially in the Western media. The way that meeting is being spun, the way that particular announcement is being spun, is that Shoigu and Putin agreed to withdraw troops, Russian troops, from Ukraine's borders. And the argument that we're now hearing from Western governments, or at least to be more precise from the US and British governments, is that this withdrawal is a fake. Those troops aren't being redeployed from the borders at all. More troops are in fact heading to the border. And even though there wasn't an invasion of Ukraine on Tuesday or on an invasion of Ukraine on Wednesday, that invasion could happen imminently or anytime soon or any day or any time over the next couple of months. Yes, there was an article by Liz Truss, British Foreign Secretary, in the Daily Telegraph, which actually said that this could go on for months. We'll come to that in a moment. For the record, Shoigu and Putin did not announce any withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine's borders. What Shoigu did, and something he does regularly, he does this several times a year, and he has done this regularly over the course of several years. He reports to Putin on the progress of military exercises. It's a standard for Russian television to film this report. Lots of Russians, serve in the Russian armed forces. Many Russian families are keen to know what their sons and daughters are doing who are serving in the military. So this is important news in Russia. Shoigu reported to Putin on the progress of military and naval exercises around Russia, but specifically in Belarus and in Crimea. And he informed Putin that those exercises are now winding down. We've always known, the Russians have always said, that the end date for the exercises in Belarus is the 20th of February, which is, of course, Sunday. And he informed Putin that with the exercises starting to wind down, some of the troops who participated in those exercises are returning to their permanent barracks, which, of course, they were always scheduled to do. So this is not, as I said, a withdrawal announcement per se, and nor is it a fake withdrawal announcement, as some governments in the West are trying to claim. It is simply Shoigu reporting to Putin about the progress of regular exercises of a kind that Russia repeatedly engages in at various times of the year in various parts of Russian territory. Now, there's a link under this video to Shoigu's report to Putin, and if you read it carefully, that all becomes entirely clear. Now, where are we? There was no invasion of Ukraine on Wednesday. There was no invasion of Ukraine on Tuesday. There was any doubt before as to who has been driving this story about a Russian invasion. It's now become blindingly clear that it is the United States and Britain, because instead of welcoming what they spun as this Russian withdrawal announcement on Tuesday, they claimed instead that the withdrawal announcement is a fake and that this agenda for starting an invasion of Ukraine is still a possibility, or at least not even a possibility, but a likelihood. The United States and Britain are still running with this story, even as doubts about it on independent media, on social media, are now starting to proliferate, even as Western governments in Europe are beginning to become increasingly skeptical, and one suspects deep down increasingly angry about the way in which this story is being dominating the headlines, is being constantly promoted in that way. And as a result, we're also starting to see a certain amount of pushback. There was meetings both of the European Council and of NATO over the course of the last few days. The NATO meeting in particular was supposed to result in important announcements. Jens Stoltenberg has been promoting the idea of deploying battle groups to Eastern Europe. But clearly there's been some pushback from some quarters because he wasn't able, in fact, to announce that. He actually had to admit that no final decision on the formation of these battle groups has been made. So clearly there are some people in NATO, some countries in NATO, which are becoming increasingly exasperated with all of this. And one that suspects this is also true about the European Union as well, because it's become clear over the last couple of days that despite all the brave talk about agreements on sanctions, the issue of sanctions is still being negotiated. There is still considerable resistance from all sorts of quarters within Europe especially. There's been pushback against sanctions announcements. We've now had, as we've seen, universal acceptance that disconnecting Russia from SWIFT is an incredibly bad idea, but it now turns out that European banks are informing their governments that they're not keen on any of the sanctions which are being floated against Russian financial institutions, and that they even want to continue trading in Russian sovereign debt, at least in the secondary debt markets. That, by the way, is remarkable, and it does rather suggest that European banks at least don't believe that an invasion of Ukraine is being planned in Moscow, and don't want to be pushed into a position where their governments commit to doing something which might never be needed, because of worry on the part of European banks that if those kind of commitments are indeed made, then that might result in steps being taken in Ukraine to make those threats of those sorts of sanctions actually happen. So, as I said, there's pushback. Interestingly enough, there's also increasing signs of exhaustion and disillusion in Ukraine itself. Wednesday, the 16th of February, which is, as I said, supposed to be Invasion Day, and may I say in parenthesis that the Americans and the British are now denying that they ever said officially that Wednesday, the 16th of February, would be Invasion Day. But the reality is that, of course, all their officials were fanning across the media, telling everybody informally that the invasion would indeed happen, at least this week, and probably on Wednesday or possibly on Tuesday. So the Western governments are pretending, British and American governments are pretending that these days didn't come from them. It's quite clear that they ultimately did. There's even a report, which, by the way, I believe that in that conference call with European leaders on Friday, Biden actually named either Tuesday or Wednesday of this week as the day when he expected the Russian invasion of Ukraine to take place. Anyway, regardless, all this talk about invasion is starting to create some pushback in Ukraine itself. And perhaps in some ways the most significant, not the most important, but the most significant event that took place on Wednesday, 16th February, was the failure of Ukrainians to attend in any number the protests that were being promoted by the Ukrainian government and by Western officials, the mass protests which were supposed to show defiance to the Russians in the face of the threat of invasion. Even Western media outlets like The Guardian were forced to admit that the attendance was desultory, and The Guardian actually reported that at one point there seemed to be more journalists covering the protest in Maidan Square than there were protesters actually present on that square. So the attendance was extraordinarily thin, and for the record, most of the people who did attend appear to have been President Zelensky's supporters, people affiliated in some cases with the far right in Ukraine, the sort of people who are strongly opposed to any kind of rapprochement with Russia, the people who within Ukraine itself have been driving the confrontation with Russia ever since the protests, the Maidan protests in Ukraine began in 2013. And I can't help but feel that what the attempt to stage these protests in Ukraine has ended up doing is shown the extent to which these far-right people are now becoming increasingly isolated from the great mass of the Ukrainian population, which has become exhausted and cynical by all this talk of war, and which has basically lost whatever belief it may once have had in the prospects of a better outcome for Ukraine from the great turn to the West that took place as a result of the Maidan events in 2014. So this was, I think, a major political and psychological blow, and it may also have strengthened the pressure that there clearly now is. Ukrainian officials have apparently, off the record, been confirming this. There's been apparently renewed pressure from the French and the Germans, who clearly don't want to be pushed into a position where they have a breakdown of relations with Russia and are forced to take action like imposing sanctions and cancelling Nord Stream 2 that they don't want to take. There's apparently increasing pressure from the French and the Germans on the Ukrainians to start working towards fulfilling the terms of the Minsk II agreement. And I discussed in the program I did yesterday about Olaf Scholz's visit to Moscow, how he managed to squirrel in during his press conference with Putin the revelation that the Ukrainians are now going to come up with draft proposals for autonomy and local government in the Donbass, and that they will be provided to the tripartite contact group at which the representatives of Donetsk and Lugansk participate before they're put to the Ukrainian parliament for possible ratification. So that does increasingly look like a move orchestrated or pressured upon Ukraine by the French and Germans to achieve some kind of forward movement on Minsk II. We will see whether that works, and already, as I've discussed before, there are already cries, especially from Britain, about appeasement, about Munich, about all of those things floating up to the surface. If there's a deal done, by the way, I suspect that before very long, especially if Germany is obviously involved in it, we'll be hearing more lurid talk, conjuring up the ghosts of Molotov and Ribbentrop from 1939 and all that. So perhaps be ready for this in advance. And perhaps a further sign that things are now starting to shift in Ukraine itself is that Zelensky himself has now come out and said that the commitment by Ukraine to join NATO, which has been embedded in Ukraine's constitution, should never have been made in that way. There should first have been a referendum to decide it. I seem to remember, by the way, that this was at one time something that was actually even promised, that previous Ukrainian governments actually said that before any commitment to join NATO was ever made by Ukraine, there would be a national referendum to decide that issue. Well, Zelensky's comments about this could be seen as an attempt to try to mobilize Ukrainian support for NATO membership, though, by the way, on the latest opinion polls, it's far from overwhelming. Or it could be seen as a way to backtrack from that commitment to join NATO, more likely the latter, or so it seems to me. And anyway, we shall see how this goes, and it could be that this is also part of some sort of negotiation that is underway. But in the meantime, as I said, the British and the French are continuing to plug away at this story about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that's always imminent, but which never happens. And we've got more news that the exodus from Kiev continues. The embassy in Kiev, the US embassy in Kiev, apparently has been entirely evacuated. Apparently all the computer programs, all the computers and all the equipment there has been destroyed, which is a remarkable thing to do, by the way. And I understand there's been reports that the CIA station in Kiev has also been evacuated, and everything now is being relocated to the western Ukrainian city of Lviv in the region formerly known as Galicia, which is the most passionate anti-Russian region in Ukraine, and one which of course borders on Poland and on other countries of the EU. And I've floated in my previous video the possibility that the plan is eventually to allow most of Ukraine to quietly collapse into Russia's hands, to set up some kind of government in Lviv, to get the government, in fact the Ukrainian government, relocated to Lviv, and to insist, of course, that this is the true Ukrainian government, and whatever entity falls under Russian control in the rest of Ukraine is somehow illegitimate. And perhaps at that point, to get this core region, or at least this rump region of Ukraine, it's not Ukraine's core region, maybe to get that incorporated into NATO, even as the rest of Ukraine is presumably abandoned to the Russians. And by the way, there are reports today, admittedly reports coming out of Donetsk and Lugansk, the two people's republics there, which perhaps should not be taken as entirely reliable, or at least at all reliable. Though I would say that the authorities in Donetsk and Lugansk have shown in the past that they're actually quite well informed about things which are going on in Kiev, which suggests either that they're being fed intelligence by the Russians, or that they have their own sources of intelligence in Kiev itself. But apparently there are reports coming out of Donetsk and Lugansk that there are indeed now active plans underway to relocate the entire Ukrainian government to Lviv, to move the ministries, the officials, all of them from Kiev to Lviv, in effect abandoning Kiev, abandoning central Ukraine and eastern Ukraine, and for what it's worth, perhaps even the military on the contact line, unless the plan is to withdraw that military to Lviv, to western Ukraine as well. I would add that if I think any attempt like that is made, the desertions will be on an enormous scale, and the formations that will indeed be withdrawn intact to western Ukraine will probably be very few, probably the notorious Azov battalion and a few formations like that. I think most of the Ukrainian army, if it's ordered to retreat in that kind of fashion, would probably simply collapse. Anyway, that might be the plan. I don't know. But whatever, it certainly seems as if, even as some Western governments, notably those of Germany and France, continue to look for ways to settle this conflict through the Minsk agreement processes, and are looking to find some way to get out of this commitment to that has been made, this very foolish and unwise commitment which was made to admit Ukraine into NATO. That they're still looking for some kind of way out of this in order to avoid having to impose sanctions on Russia, something which they absolutely do not want to do, even as the French and the Germans are trying to engineer that. Other countries, notably Britain and the United States, at the moment seem to be pursuing a radically different agenda, which looks like trying to create some kind of crisis in Ukraine, and with some indications now that they might even be looking in some kind of way to collapse the central and eastern parts of the country into Russia's hands. The idea, I suppose, would in that case to leave a kind of vacuum, which the Russians might feel obliged to fill, and to spin that as some kind of invasion, and then to put the pressure on the French and the Germans to impose sanctions. I accept that is all very, very speculative, but this flight from Kiev is very difficult to explain in any other way. And I am, if anyone else could come up with an alternative explanation that makes sense, perhaps they could tell me what it is. I would add that even if there is a threat of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, the abandonment of Kiev in this kind of way gives a disastrous impression. After all, when Kabul fell, the Taliban didn't storm the US or Western embassies in Kabul, so why assume that the Russians would do the same in Kiev? It seems all but inconceivable that that danger actually exists. Anyway, there we are. I would make a few further points. Firstly, all of this tension is already having severe economic impacts around the world. One of them is that there's been a sharp rise in the oil price. Up to the moment of the Russian announcement of the drawdown of troops from the exercise in Belarus and Crimea, Urals crude, which is one of the types of oil which is internationally traded, Urals crude was trading at $100 a barrel, and other types of crude oil, Brent crude, all the others, they are all of them as of now trading at over $90 a barrel. Some of them significantly higher than this. We're very, very close to a situation when the oil price finally hits $100 a barrel and stays there, and possibly even goes north of that number. The implications for household bills in Europe and in the United States, perhaps, is something people ought to be considering, because it's going to have major repercussions, I would have thought, on living standards. And it was striking that President Biden, in his latest comments about the crisis, actually seemed to be warning people that higher energy prices are on the way. Might be worth considering what the implications of all this war scare are. They are already having an effect on inflationary pressures. They're leading to rises in energy costs, which are going to be transmitted all around the world. And of course, particularly vulnerable here is Europe. As we all know, Europe imports around 40% of its natural gas from Russia. What many people don't know is that it also imports around a quarter of its crude oil from Russia as well. Russia is Europe's biggest supplier of crude oil. If that is interrupted, it would have major repercussions on the European energy system, just as interruptions of natural gas prices, gas from Russia would also have major implications for the European energy situation. I would add that this rise in oil and gas prices is currently providing significant strengthening to the Russian financial position. One other effect of this particular geopolitical crisis is that it is depressing the value of the ruble. The ruble ought to be rising in value with the oil price. Instead, it has been, if anything, falling slightly. So that means that the Russians are able to produce oil and gas cheaply at depressed rubles and get paid for it in constantly appreciating prices, which are of course priced, in the case of crude, in dollars. So for the Russians, this is creating an extraordinary financial bonanza, which of course again is not being reported. We haven't received the most recent reports about the state of Russian foreign currency reserves as a result of the events of the last couple of weeks, but I for one would not be surprised if we see them jump, and if we are not seeing them jump, that's almost certainly because the Russian government is working with Russian corporates to redistribute funds provided from the sales of gas and oil to Russian corporates to provide them with foreign currency to shield them further from any further sanctions risks going down the line. But regardless, the Russians are obviously gaining a considerable financial bonanza from all of this, something which I've noticed is not being reported in the West. And of course, not just the Russians, but all the oil producers. People like Maduro in Venezuela, people like MBS in Saudi Arabia, are all doing financially extremely well out of this crisis at the moment. And of course, the other effect that all of this is happening is that it's keeping attention away from other things. And we've been hearing an awful lot about the Russian build-up in Europe, mythological though I suspect that actually is, and that has distracted attention from the very real Russian build-up which is currently underway in Syria. The Russians have now redeployed more Tupolev 22M3 heavy bombers to their airbase at Khmeimim in Syria. This is a very heavily enlarged airbase that the Russians have been expanding ever since they entered Syria in 2015. It now has 2 runways, and these Tupolev 22 M3 bombers are of course equipped with very powerful Kh-23 supersonic anti-ship missiles, able to contest US and NATO naval dominance of the Mediterranean. And they're also being supplemented with MiG-23 supersonic fighter bombers, which are equipped with Kinjal hypersonic missiles, the kind of missiles that are also intended to be launched against aircraft carriers and other facilities. Now, this does change the military balance in the Mediterranean. I've discussed this some months ago in another video. It means that the Mediterranean is no longer the NATO lake, which it has been basically ever since the Second World War, and that the Russians are now in a position to provide serious military challenges to NATO fleets operating in the Mediterranean. And again, I think that the importance of the Mediterranean is often little understood. Not only does it threaten NATO's soft underbelly, places like Italy, Greece, the Balkans, southern France, and wherever, but more importantly, the Mediterranean is a critically important sea route for commodities, oil, for example, from the Gulf to come to Europe, and not just oil, but all sorts of products. They come by container ship or tanker into the Mediterranean via the Suez Canal, and that's how an awful lot of Europe's foreign trade is conducted. And the Russians have now established a very powerful air base in Syria, equipped with extremely potent weapons and aircraft, which is standing or sitting on top of this vitally important trade route, able conceivably at some point to take action with respect to it. And to give an idea of how important this deployment of forces to Syria is, the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has just been to Syria. He's toured the base. He's spoken to the various people there. I understand he's had a meeting with President Assad. So Shoigu has been in Syria. Notice that he has been in Syria rather than in Moscow plotting his great invasion of Ukraine. And it's fascinating to see how, with all the focus on Ukraine, these Russian deployments in Syria have gone almost completely unreported in the media. Well, where is this all going? As I'm making this video, there's been reports of more shelling in the Donbass, and some people are wondering whether this is the moment that the great confrontation in the Donbass is going to begin, whether this is going to be the trigger of the Russian invasion or counter-invasion or whatever. It's possible. I have to say that the initial reports speak of heavy exchanges of fire, but they do not suggest deployment of heavy artillery to any great degree. Most of the fighting seems to have been cases of mortar fire and exchanges of rocket-propelled grenades and things like this. This is reasonably short-range weapon systems. It looks more like exchanges of fire across the contact line, as opposed to any major attempt by either side to prepare for some big offensive there. If we start to see heavy artillery being used in quantity, there was one report that one particular gun, a 122mm gun, was fired, but that's only one gun. If we start to see heavy artillery being used in quantity, then that will be a much more serious